Gillerman, who's joining us on the dais. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Irwin Cotler. Professor Irwin Cotler is a member of Parliament, a law professor, a constitutional and comparative law scholar, international human rights lawyer, counsel to prisoners of conscience, NGO head, public, intellectual, community leader, and peace activist. He's a member of Parliament, a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Irwin Cotler has been variously described in these roles and responsibilities as being at the forefront of the struggle for justice, peace, and human rights. Irwin Cotler is presently a Canadian Member of Parliament, first elected by a by-election in November 1999 with a 92% result of the votes, as what was characterized as the most stunning electoral victory in this century by any standard. He was re-elected in the general elections of November 2000, June 2004, and January 2006 with the highest Liberal majority in the country. On December 12, 2003, the Prime Minister appointed him Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Mr. Cotler is currently on leave as a Professor of Law at McGill University, where he is Director of its Human Rights Program and Chair of Inter Amicus, the McGill-based International Human Rights Advocacy Center. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at Yale Law School, and is a recipient of 8 honorary doctorates, including one from York University, whose citation referred to him as a scholar and advocate of international stature. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, he litigated every section of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including landmark cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, women's rights, minority rights, war crimes justice, prisoners' rights, and peace law. He has testified as an expert witness on human rights before the parliamentary committees in Canada, the United States, Russia, Sweden, Norway, and Israel, and has lectured at a major international academic conferences. He has lectured in both Arab countries and Israel for over 30 years. He has been an active participant in rapprochement dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians. He was the first government minister to visit the Middle East, promoted a common justice agenda in the region, and secured agreement among the justice ministers of Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, and the Palestine Authority to participate in the first ever Joint Justice Forum. Professor Cotler is an academic ray of light to all of us in the world who believe in fighting terrorism, and basically for all of those who believe in human rights, and especially balance it with the right to life of those who are being threatened by terrorists. If Professor Cotler didn't exist, he would have to be created. Professor Cotler.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that rather extravagant introduction. Your own name is the same as that of my son, Jonathan Yoni, as we call him, so I will just mention what would be his riposte to your introduction, and which he obliges me to make whenever I receive these excessive introductions at any conference or hearing. And first I have to preface it, it's not an appropriate thing to say at a conference of this kind with its sophistication in technology, but that is why you'll see why his riposte is a humbling rebuttal to what you mentioned. And I have to make full disclosure at the outset. I happen to be what may be called technically illiterate, or to use the politically correct language of the day, technically challenged. I don't know how emails work, computers, videos, any of the data processing that underpins the technology of this conference and the combating of terror. Some of you might say you should already sit down if that's the case. Well, my son, who's now 20, when he was 3 years of age, somehow having a prescient sense that I didn't know how these things work, came up to me one day with that mischievous grin that has become his trademark and said to me, looking up at me, he said, "Daddy, can you help me fix the video?" And I said to him, "Well, Yoni, I don't know how to fix the video." And he looked at me with that mischievous grin and he said, "I know, Daddy. All I'm asking you to do is to pick me up because I can't reach it." Whereupon my daughter later in the day said to me, "Daddy, do you know what Yoni said to me?" And I said, "No." He said, "Gila, Daddy may be a nice man, but he's not very smart. He's not very smart." That's the riposte for that introduction. Boaz indicated at the beginning that we met, some 25 years ago. Then he was a student, and I was a professor discussing the whole issues of terrorism. Well, I have to say, Boaz, 25 years later, I, like many others in this room, are your students, and you are our teacher and mentor. If I may just make one plug for Canada, you mentioned about the rain. If in Canada we would say this is yet another manifestation of global warming, and we should take the initiative to combat that as well. Let me, in terms of my remarks today, also refer to something that Boaz said yesterday evening. Where has he put it? We meet on the evening of the Jewish New Year, a time for reflection and remembrance, zichronot. And as it happens this year, the New Year comes immediately after the anniversary of 9/11 that we commemorate at this conference. And when one speaks of 9/11, I recall at the time it was said of it that the world was changed. I don't know whether the world was changed by 9/11 or whether 9/11 exposed a radical evil that was already present before. But it is clear that 9/11 and its aftermath has had a dramatic impact not only on our psyches but on our politics, not only on our policies but on our practices. But there is another event to which Boaz referred to as well, another event which was also a transformative event at the time, but which has gone largely, if not wholly, unremarked or uncommemorated, but which is not unrelated and which deserves mention today. I'm referring to the fact that we are also commemorating the 6th anniversary of the Durban Conference, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, which turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel, the Jewish people, the West, and the like. And I mention this because it is part of the theme of my remarks, and that is that if 9/11 overshadowed Durban and its radical ideological manifestations foreshadowed 9/11. As a colleague of mine put it, perhaps with some exaggeration by analogy, but again where a point is being made, where he said that if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, Durban, and those of us who experienced it would understand what my colleague who was there said, 9/11 was its Mein Kampf. And so, with that context and in those contours, I'd like to organize my remarks around two themes. The first is to discuss, and I'll do this by way of a summary snapshot, the escalation, globalization, virulence, and even lethality of global jihadism. What might be called the ideological and theological precursor and precipitator for the radical evil of terrorism itself. And second, the remedies to combat it. But when one speaks of remedies, to appreciate, and in a kind of dialectical way, you'll see this within the remedies themselves, the kind of ignoring, sanitizing, indulging, excusing, and even justification that goes on with respect to addressing this global jihadism that we need to redress if we want to combat the terror which is its instrumentalist manifestation. And so let me go first to the dynamics, the cluster of dynamics that make up this radical global jihadism, and using Iran, if I may, as a case study. The first is what might be called the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. And I don't use those words easily or lightly, but there are no other words to describe what is today Ahmadinejad's Iran. And I use the words Ahmadinejad's Iran because I don't want to conflate the people and the publics of Iran, many of whom are themselves in opposition to Ahmadinejad and the Iranian leadership, with the incitement of that leadership itself. Where you find the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most virulent of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, propelled by a publicly exposed intent to acquire nuclear weapons, dramatized by the parading in the streets of Tehran of a Shihab-3 missile draped in the emblem which you've read about, etc., saying that Israel must be wiped off the map, but not the other four words that are also there and that need to be read with it. As the Imam says, the kind of fanatical religious underpinning to it, warning Muslims who seek peace with Israel that they will burn in the Ummah of Islam, and the whole inspired by kind of eschatological fanaticism that sees the destruction of Israel, the destruction of the West, and in the words, death to Israel, death to America, as being the kind of apocalyptic precursor to the messianic coming of the 12th Imam Mahdi, and hence that kind of radical religious exploitation of Iran, but indoctrination as well. The second dynamic here in this jihadism is the state-sanctioned incitement and support for international terrorism. And here again, I will use Iran as a state, as a case study. Some of us may not appreciate that in November of last year, the Argentinian judiciary, following upon a report of its state prosecutors, issued a report where it found that the Iranian leadership, including President Rafsanjani at the time, in 1994, the same President Rafsanjani who is sometimes characterized as a moderate, but who has also spoken of the need to annihilate Israel, who has now just been elected the chairman of the Council of Experts in Iran itself. This same Rafsanjani and those associated with him in the Iranian regime at the time were, in the finding of fact and conclusion of law of the Argentinian judiciary report, were held responsible for conceiving, planning and ordering the bombing of the AMIA, the Jewish Community Center in Argentina, in 1994, which, as the Minister of Justice told us when I was there in October of this past year, told us at the time that this was the greatest terrorist mass atrocity, generally speaking, that had impacted on Argentina since the end of the Second World War. And more, found that the body that had executed this terrorist act was none other than Hezbollah, at the instigation of Iran, and that Hezbollah had embedded itself in the whole infrastructure of Argentina and Latin America and the like. The report is worth reading because it is a case study of Iran as a state supporter of international terrorism and the role that Hezbollah plays in it, which leads me to the third dynamic here in this cluster of jihadist dynamics, and that is that the covenants and charters, the platforms and policies of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of Islamic Jihad, and I can go on, in the same vein as its patron, Iran, are genocidal in their objective, anti-Semitic in their ideology, totalitarian in their conception and structure, and terrorist in their instrumentality. In fact, when you look at Hamas, for example, its state-sanctioned incitement to genocide is not only declaratory, which is bad enough, as in the case of Ahmadinejad's Iran, but is actually covenantal. It's right there in the Hamas charter. And you have, in terms of Nasrallah, speaking as he has on a number of occasions of the need for the disappearance of Israel. And I find it somewhat ironic in terms of the talk about asymmetrical warfare, the Israel-Hezbollah war, which I regard not a kind of asymmetrical analysis of asymmetrical warfare, because it was not just Israel against Hezbollah. It was Israel against Hezbollah supported by its state sponsors, Iran and Syria. And so there was a multi-symmetrical warfare. And unless you understand that, you cannot just look at it in terms of the configuration of Israel and Hezbollah. But even looking at it in terms of the configuration of Israel and Hezbollah, I found that the media, for example, totally ignored the kind of genocidal intentionality of Hezbollah itself. Let me just give you two quotes, where Nasrallah said that if all the Jews were gathered in Israel, it would be easier to kill them all at the same time. But if you want a very specific and express manifestation of this kind of genocidal ideology and anti-Semitic ideology as a kind of prologue for that genocidal objective, and I know that these words are harsh words, but I have no other words to describe what Nasrallah said. They shall be known by their words. But in all the coverage of the Israel-Hezbollah war, this kind of criminal intentionality was never seen. Let me just refer to Nasrallah's remarks, who was said with regard to a rather defamatory and incendiary expression regarding Jews, and I quote, "If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak, and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology, and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew." Notice, said Nasrallah, I do not say the Israeli, I say the Jew. Where Shiite scholar Amal Saad Goyarab, the author of the book Hezbollah, Politics and Religion, says that this statement, and I'm quoting her, provides moral justification and ideological justification for dehumanizing the Jews. In this view, she went on, the Israeli Jew becomes a legitimate target for extermination, and it also legitimizes attacks on non-Israeli Jews. And that is why I speak of this phenomenon of jihadism in terms of the covenants and charters, platforms and policies of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like, as yet another pernicious evil and manifestation of this jihadism. Continuing in that regard, let me move now to a fourth manifestation of jihadism, which are the religious fatwas or execution writs, where the terrorist acts are themselves held out as being a religious obligation, where the targets are characterized as being the perfidious enemies of Islam, where the perpetrators are not only characterized as martyrs, but are glorified in their martyrdom. Number 5, one might say in this sense that Israel emerges in that regard as a kind of target state, not only as it is sometimes called as the Jew among the nations, but as the Salman Rushdie among the nations, as the target of these fatwas. Which brings me to the fifth dynamic, and I'll move more quickly here in this cluster of dynamics that are the manifestation of this global jihadism. Fifth is the escalating phenomenon of domestic extremism, of which you'll hear more in this conference, for which London, Madrid, Berlin, now Toronto, and Canada, in the peaceable kingdom, as we like to call Canada, one finds here terrorism as the final act of this jihadist scenario. Sixth is the critical mass of this state-sanctioned trafficking of hate. I'm referring to the teaching of contempt and the demonizing of the other in the mosques, in the media, in the schools, in the refugee and summer camps, and the like. The seventh is the electronic jihad. Again, you'll hear more about it in this conference. The immediacy and globality of the transmission of this state-sanctioned culture of hate. And we should not ignore that what we're talking about here is our state-sanctioned culture of hate. We're not talking about the kind of individual hate speech that might find expression in a democracy like Canada and elsewhere, but the state-sanctioned culture of hate, which is transmitted globally through the internet, websites, tapes, cassettes, media such as Al-Manar and the like. And here too, a case study of the sanitizing, the excusing, the indulging of this kind of jihadism. When the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1701, putting an end to the Israel-Hezbollah war, calling for the ceasefire, there is no reference in that resolution none at all to the need to combat this kind of state-sanctioned incitement to hate that finds expression in Al-Manar on an ongoing basis. No reference at all to the jihadism in the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which is supposed to combat the terrorism emanating from Lebanon. 8 is what might be called the trahison d'éclair. Here I'm referring to, as I say, the treason of the intellectuals, literally translated, but the preponderant involvement of academics and scholars and journalists and clerics in the propagation of this culture of hate, in this kind of preparation of a state of radicalization for the bringing about of the terrorism, which is its ultimate response. The 9 is the rayonnement, the diffusion in the mass media, and so you have the kind of incitation and incantation from above joined with the so-called vox populi, the voice of the masses from below as incited from those from above. 10, you have the domestic, and reference was made to this in Boaz's closing remarks, the domestic repression of human rights. Where, again, if you use Iran as a case study, the domestic repression of women, of students, of the labor movement, and one can go on, reminding us of the adage that those that will engage in a massive repression of the rights of their own citizens will also threaten the rights of their neighbors. And finally, if I may make a reference to this as well, and that is the delegitimization and demonization of Israel, which is part of the prologue with respect to not only providing a justificatory basis for the terror, but also excusing the terror itself. Again, Durban is a case study in this regard, because the clarion call at Durban was where the delegitimization of Israel marched in a sophisticated way under the banner of the struggle against racism. And so the clarion call was that the 20th century called for the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state. The clarion call for the 21st century must call for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Not simply that Israel is an apartheid state. That is its own, type of radical critique. But the dismantling of Israel, because it's an apartheid state, so that delegitimization is to lead to dismantling. And more than that, that Israel is a Nazi state. Not only must it be dismantled as part of the struggle against racism, but there's a moral imperative that it be dismantled, because an apartheid Nazi state does not have a right to exist. And so Durban then went on to say, therefore, terrorism, as we would call it, against this apartheid Nazi state is legitimate resistance. And so you have the whole Orwellian inversion with respect to the struggle against terror. And I might add that the UN Human Rights Council, the successor to the discredited United Nations Commission on Human Rights, aids and abets this whole phenomenon of delegitimization and demonization, because in the first year of its operation, not much is mentioned of this in Israel because of the fact of the notion here that still has its kind of fallout. Ambassador Gillerman knows about this much better than I and speaks to this much more eloquently at the United Nations itself. And that is the whole phenomenon of Shmum. But one should not ignore the fallout of where a United Nations Human Rights Council and where its decision-making processes are attended by parliamentarians and media and students, and I can go on and go on. In the first year of its operation, had 11 condemnations against one member state in the international community, namely Israel. There was not one resolution of condemnation against any of the other 191 members of the international community. Not one. Thereby giving exculpatory immunity to the worst human rights violators of our time, including Sudan with its genocide by attrition, or Iran itself. No reference to the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Iran. Not one reference before the UN Human Rights Council. And yet the drumbeat of indictment with respect to one other member state of the international community that is singled out for differential and discriminatory treatment. So the question then becomes, what then do we do? Having described this, and I want to just give a snapshot of a number of remedies. I happen to be one that does not believe that one should indulge only that of the global jihadism and walk out and say, my God, you know, everybody is against this, the whole world is against this, there's nothing we can do. I don't believe that at all. I believe there are remedies and there are things that we can do. The problem is that these remedies are not being invoked and exercised and applied because of part of that dynamic that I otherwise mentioned of ignoring and indulging and sanitizing the very jihadism with which is confronting us. The first remedy is a panoply of legal remedies. It is astonishing. It is astonishing that the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran has yet to be taken up by the UN Security Council and United Nations agencies, even though the Genocide Convention and the Treaty for an International Criminal Court prohibit the public and direct incitement to genocide. It is astonishing that not one state in the international community, because Iran is a state party to the Genocide Convention, and so any state in the international community which is a state party can bring an interstate complaint against Iran before the International Court of Justice with respect to this public and direct incitement to genocide, which is a violation of the Genocide Convention. No initiative of that kind has yet been taken. No reference has been made within the UN Security Council to refer this to the International Criminal Court. I'm not saying that Israel should be the one to do this, and I understand why Israel should not be at the forefront of doing it. But other states who have been prepared to refer, as they belatedly did, the Darfuri criminals to the International Criminal Court should be prepared to refer those engaged in the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, the most horrific of crimes, the clear violation of the ICC Treaty and the Genocide Convention, to the International Criminal Court for investigation and accountability. Otherwise, we perpetuate the culture of impunity in face of this state-sanctioned culture of hate. So much for the panoply of legal remedies. I can give you more. I just give you a number of them. There is, as well, with respect to the defiance by Iran with regard to the United Nations Security Council resolutions that it cease and desist from processing enriched uranium on the road to becoming, a nuclear power. And here, too, what is necessary at this point is that the United Nations move to pass a comprehensive UN Security Council resolution which would, in fact, target the vulnerable energy sector and the oil and energy sectors in Iran, that would target the military-industrial complex which is financing the state terrorism, which would target as well the banking sector in Iran. I can go on. What is needed here is a clear and comprehensive UN Security Council resolution, which is being discussed. It would be the third resolution of its kind. Ambassador Gillerman can speak more compellingly about this. But again, a second remedy here is a comprehensive and targeted UN Security Council resolution, which would hold Iran accountable for its continued processing of enriched uranium and plutonium in defiance of the UN Security Council resolutions, international law, and the like. The third has to do with a whole series of initiatives that can be taken with respect to combating. Got it. Moving to a close. I've been told I've got 5 minutes, and I'll finish within that time. And that is what can be done with regard to Iran as a state sponsor of international terrorism, and indeed what can be done with regard to combating the international terrorism itself. First, member states should support the execution of the arrest warrants that were issued by the Argentinian judiciary for the named Iranian authorities of whom I referred to earlier. It's a tragedy that not one state has yet supported the issuance of international arrest warrants by the Argentinian judiciary to hold the Iranian officials responsible. Only the United States has made movement in this regard. Second, economic sanctions, as I mentioned, must target the specific organizations responsible for state-sanctioned terrorism. Particular case study would be the Quds Force, a branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, which is responsible for arming, training, and supporting terrorist groups like Herzliya and Hamas. Third, anti-terrorist initiatives must include the targeting of the Iranian banks to which I referred. The United Nations and the international community should revisit international humanitarian law so as to address the issues of asymmetrical warfare as exemplified in the Israel-Hezbollah war and along the lines that Boaz himself recommended. The European Union and individual member states should declare Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization, thereby prohibiting the forms of association and assistance with it, including prohibitions on Hezbollah fundraising, financing, and participation in acts of terror. It's astonishing that Hezbollah has not yet been declared as a terrorist organization by the European Union, or even in Latin America, or even in Argentina, knowing of the pernicious terrorism of Hezbollah. Indeed, senior Hezbollah officials have said, and Nasrallah himself has said, that such a declaration, declaring Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization, would severely impair, if not disable, the very terrorist operations of Hezbollah itself. Finally, victims of international terrorism have, in particular under American law, civil remedies to hold those that have been involved in the support and the finance, in the recruitment, etc., of this kind of international terrorism to account. There are other remedies I won't go into in the divestment remedy, parliamentary initiatives. Time does not permit public diplomacy, though I do want to make some reference to this. I do believe that along with the kind of sanctioning approach, we should be engaged in a public diplomacy approach with respect to supporting particularly the publics and groups in Iran who are the targets of the massive domestic repression in Iran, just like we should in terms of the Prague Charter, which was an important, though not yet appreciated, declaration that took place in a conference that was co-chaired, among others, by Václav Havel and Natan Sharansky in Prague in June this year, came out with a Prague Declaration calling upon the Western and international community to engage in what might be called a principled human rights foreign policy to hold the perpetrators of terrorism and incitement and the like to account, while supporting at the same time the dissidents in these countries who put themselves on the line in defying those enemies. So let me close by saying global jihadism in all its manifestations, as I've mentioned, whose ultimate instrumentality is the terrorism itself, the radical evil, is as pervasive as it is persistent, as serious as it is substantial. But I believe that a multi-layered strategy, a multi-layered and comprehensive remedial strategy can address it and can redress it. And perhaps at this point one can say on the eve of Rosh Hashanah that Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker, to be translated that a just cause, and this is a just cause, will ultimately prevail. Thank you.